Hello everyone, today we take a comprehensive look at Otto I's expeditions against the Slavs. Right, I already made a video about Henry the Fowler's, Otto's father's year 929 campaigns against the Slavs. I'm using the term Slavs for the sake of simplicity, but of course these were different peoples, loosely coalesced, admittedly, against Eastern Frankish expansionism that was targeting their land, right? And so we have already observed in that video, and we will look at Ottonian warfare at a point also on the Western front against the Western Franks, etc. So there is quite interesting context for the development of what was becoming, in fact, the Imperial military machine, right? We have appreciated properly the nature of this Eastern frontiers warfare made by a lot of sieges, say ambushes, attritional warfare. The Germans mostly targeted the fortified and hilltops of the Slavs. We've seen Henry the Fowler's campaign against Prague, right, and the surrounding fortifications in the area. They were massive with perimeters of multiple kilometers, right, thousands of defenders, etc. Today we'll look in part at the same places, but in the following generation, to the one of Henry, of course, and literally so from a biological point of view, when next to the continuity you appreciate the progress that the Eastern Franks made against their Eastern neighbors, right? This space, as we will see now, is more permeable, right? Some of the routes of invasion used by the Eastern Franks into Western Slavic territory have been partly consolidated, partly conquered properly, fortified. We've seen it with settlements like Meissen before the capture of Brandenburg under Havel in the north. And of course, especially when we make those videos about basic kind of manualistic medieval history, we talk about, and this year was this expedition against the Bohemians. We will talk about it at all when talking about the much bigger picture, of course, of Ottonian history. But of course, there is a more detailed military one that unfortunately is not very documented. We are in Central Europe in the 10th century, and also Central Europe a bit towards areas that were not even fully Christianized and even less literate in that regard. So sometimes we, even for the same Eastern Franks, we can't say that there wasn't a dramatic historiographical output, but there was one, right? And of course, this tells us concretely, even in few terms, right, what the hard nature of this frontier really was. Otto I doesn't need introductions. He was actively pursuing an international policy of imperial expansion, and the eastern frontier was particularly relevant in function of his dealing with the Magyars that, as you know, were, say, finally crushed after the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, but also the much older attrition carried out by, I don't know, the same Henry the Fowler had defeated them at Riade. The Bavarians, that were actually the most involved Germans on the Magyar frontier, had, say, unfortunately for them, like a less, say, less propaganda, right? Otto I won everything in terms of his imperial celebration, etc. So we know much more about his exploit than the ones of the Ottonian branch in Bavaria, but we will look at that as well at some point, because those are a bit the unsung heroes, we can say, at least in this Eastern Frankish struggle against the Magyars, that were making leverage on the Western Slavs in general to pressure the eastern frontier of the German kingdom. Right? Generally speaking, nobody liked the Magyars more than much, say, especially who was, like in Europe, in a sanitary context, the same Bohemians had successfully escaped the say direct rule, differently from Great Moravia, that had been basically dissolved by the Hungarian invasions and so on. But in any case, this part, say Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria, were still by the mid 10th century to normalize the situation, to get rid of the greater the stabilizing factor of the Magyars, of which we will not talk much today, except for the fact that the army we're describing here and some of the same commanders were involved. In fact, the emperor, his vassals, and so on, against the Slavs as much as other enemies, right? So this is always to be kept in mind, as far as also the influence on Slavic warfare is concerned, meaning that, as we will see, there were naturally Slavic auxiliaries used by the Germans. There was a general framing, consolidation of these peoples within the German Imperial orbit at large, so that some of the places we observe today were, of course, Western Slavic at the time. Today are part of probably of the modern country of Germany. So many things happen starting and especially around this time with incredible brutality, but also incredible success, right? From the German side, the Slavs were not tender-souled people, to say the least. But in any case, they got the worst of it. And they, in a sense, won in another way, meaning that they got eventually Christianized, Roman. I mean, the concept that a Western, right, dimension, especially for, in fact, what we call the Western Slavs, was generally profitable civilizationally, right, in the rest of their existence. Now, Otto I, so the context is obvious. The Eastern Franks were coming out of decades of warfare, of general instability, of lack, essentially, of functional monarchy that starts occurring, in fact, just in these generations with the rise of the House of Saxony, and equipped with that essentially Frankish profile that is common to all post-Carolingian Europe, based on essentially a vassalatic beneficiary system that is in practice capable of producing a contained but very high quality, in fact elite, of heavily armored mounted fighters, right? We have appreciated, of course, that also in the past video, that Central Europe was not exactly or necessarily the best ground for mounted warfare yet. Actually, there was a lot of it, right? What always surprises me is that, I don't know, the Poles had, by the beginning of the second millennium, 1/3 of their contingent mounted, right? The problem is also how we appreciated it even the other day in that video about the much later Lithuanian warfare, let's say at the end of the Middle Ages, that has to do with the strategic and tactical implications of this, so the quality, the quantity involved here. This is to say that, of course, Central Europe was largely covered in forests, in swamps. Of course, there was good ground for open field kind of cavalry charges were evolving towards an ever more packed and collectively trained kind of shock function, right? And this was true for the same Slavs that had the same elite, just by a lesser degree than the objectively more advanced Eastern French, right? And most of these people's activities were military in nature, right? Because the only way to consolidate power at this point was hammering down pretty hard your neighbors, conquering their fortresses, deporting their people, installing your garrisons locally, and working very, very hard, not just with the sword, but also with, let's say, civil tools to build literally civilization in a place where not even cities had ever properly existed, where again the church had, and all the infrastructural and patrimonial implications that had still to be established. Largely, the Germans at some point wouldn't be stopped even by the fact that some of these peoples were already Christians, or they had Christianizing corner to avoid armed conquest. In any case, the relations were traumatically brutal, to say the least. And in fact, this is one of the single most overlooked frontier, I think, in the history of European warfare. Otto I was the typical 10th century German monarch. I mean, he was illiterate practically. He spent his entire life on horseback. These were incredibly energetic individuals, right? Otto is one of the great leaders of the Germanic epos, right? Together with Charlemagne, Frederick Barbarossa, etc. He embodies, he's credited with the refoundation of what we eventually called the Holy Roman Empire. It was the same empire of Charlemagne, and properly with the Ottonians, the Roman one by form and ethnic reference, institutionally. So this was all that the Renamatsu Empire was in theory, but it was in theory exactly through this incredibly violent as relentless work of conquest and consolidation of the eastern frontier, just like it had been in the case for Charlemagne and the Saxons, and also the Slavs already at the time, because knock out the Saxons further east you have the Slavs, and that's how it all began. We could make some video here about the Carolingian expeditions, the early ones. And during Otto's reign, between 936 and 973, several expeditions were launched in some good style, in fact, at the eastern frontiers of the German kingdom. In 950, Otto launches a major invasion of Bohemia. Right, it was at least the closest problem. The country would be eventually incorporated within the same, say, Holy Roman Empire, differently from Poland, etc., but even acquiring essentially a sort of honorific, call it German role as elector much later on. I made recently a video about the Duchy of Bohemia. We'll come back on Czech history, hopefully soon. And the center of Bohemia was already, as we appreciated, for 929, Prague. Right, it had this immense fortification for Western Slavic standards. Again, all the data are also technically in the previous video. We will see it. I will post the list of related videos in the comments fixed at the top. However, as we have already seen in that video, the Saxon route of advance for the invasion of Bohemia was naturally the Elbe Valley, which was rising up, passing through essentially the Mark of Thuringia was established at that point, the East Mark on its right, etc. So all land that the Germans had been consolidating their control. Meaningfully enough, the Saxon bases of operations were in Magdeburg, that was exactly in the southeast of the duchy, and so on the Elbe. And so if you have visited it, it's also where Otto is buried. There's a beautiful cathedral. There is also the statue of Saint Maurice, by the way, one of the earliest representations of plate armor in Western warfare. And just across the Elbe, you have this, essentially the Western Slavic territory, one that the Germans had started colonizing. It's hundreds of kilometers up to Bohemia, and the first target was the fortress of Nymburk, situated on the Elbe, approximately 40 kilometers east of Prague, right? Because the Elbe goes east, but there are other rivers that connect it eventually with the heart of Bohemia. And these fortifications are very important because they form a sort of curtain around Prague. I mean, you can actually pass in between, but it's strategically risky because the enemy can carry out sorties, flank attacks from there, so threatening your supply lines, etc. So in order to score a significant result in Bohemia, you have to erode this curtain, right? Even just for the next campaigns that will take place, because these are regions in which sooner or later you're coming back, right? In a lifetime and so on, and that thus must be also weakened, because most of these invasions were not, of course, aiming at permanently occupying now just such a significant territorial policy like Bohemia. Rather, that would have been ungovernable, right? Would have always brought problems like enormous resources to put down rebellions, resistance, and so on. But just to, in fact, as it would have happened historically, frame the country within your own sphere of influence, right, and making it part, as we've seen at a point, even to imperial policy, the Bohemians would be later on, generally speaking, always very supportive of royal policy in Germany. So this this fortress of Nymburk was captured, after which Otto marched on Prague. And the Annals of Flodoard, one of our sources, tell us very clearly, Otto rex qui quandam Venedorum magnam obsederat urbem nomine proadem regem ipsorum in subjectionem recipit. Right? That is to say, what happened already in 929 with Vaclav, right? The latter's brother, the Duke Boleslav I of Bohemia, ruling between 935 and 972, decided to surrender, to accept essentially Ottonian overlordship, which entailed a degree of essentially a tribute in resources, in military assistance from Bohemia and so on, because the Ottonian army was deemed to be strong enough at least to cause a significant damage, if not necessarily to Prague or even managing to storm it, but still causing so much turmoil in the rest of the country. It would have been very detrimental, to say the least, to the ducal power. This was the main problem. Like, it's better if the Germans go away as quickly as possible, so at least that my subjects will not rebel against me for having, and in that sense, maybe being co-opted by the Germans to overthrow me and all this stuff, and even getting something in return, because you are at that point recognized by the Eastern Frankish king as the ruler of Bohemia, which also internationally is quite a big deal. Naturally, the reason why the Bohemians had rebelled, disobeyed to the Ottonians, was still having some margin of maneuver for doing whatever they wanted as they could right before these punitive expeditions would have been carried out. Right. Widukind, other chronicler of the Ottonian era, states that Boleslav made his decision because of the strength and enormous size of the Eastern Frankish army. He literally says, considerata itaque virtute regis ac innumera multitudine exercitus. Right, so the innumera multitudo exercitus is the innumerable, that is of course an hyperbole, but the infinite, the uncountable multitude of the army. And remember that in Widukind's language, that is in this sense pretty standard, exercitus means the expeditionary levy of Saxony, to which he adds, or at least contrasts, the milites, right, from the other side. So the professional soldiers serving in the military households of magnates. There are interesting studies in this regard, because miles, as you know in Latin, stem from the fact that the legionnaires were paid. So these were professional soldiers who received like huscarls, like all these essentially men-at-arms that were maintained at the expenses of the lord, right, and that de facto counted as full-time warriors, also because that's what they did mostly. They were essentially bodyguards, and they formed the core of the magnates' force on the battlefield. They operated also in quite close-knit fashion, with a spirit of corps, sense of munus, so duty and reward. It was a way of social promotion. And as you know, the 10th century, we made multiple videos about this, is the moment in which post-Carolingian Europe, and by osmosis and just by local dynamics, the affirmation of a European military class, so what we recognize as a knights, starts becoming universal, and exactly in this function, right? Heavily armored, mounted warriors that, however, can also and often do fight dismounted anyway, and they're a bit like the factotum of the army, right? It's the stormtroopers, it's the shock troops, it's the ones who lead the assault. Like, they are essentially the core around which the rest of the army revolves around. So the levies, of course, necessary to blockade the settlements during the sieges, but these guys, and supporting with also missile fire, etc., the militaires that had to storm the walls. And as we will see now, these Slavs actually built very impressive fortresses that, as we have seen archaeologically, turns out were new, right, to the situation, and began to pop up, in fact, exactly in correspondence chronologically with the German invasions, right? So something that in local Slavic warfare had not had much of a raison d'être, but that in this Metus Hostilis had helped to make stronger local polities coalescing, such as in the case of Bohemia. It is a pretty orderly, tight, compact power for Slavic standards. Like, it's smaller, of course, but Poland is much messier in a way, but it's bigger also. And thus there are many of these guys, and still the boundaries are very fluid still between Bohemia, Poland. They try to attack across, the mountains each other. We'll see it perhaps in other videos. The Slavs, of course, have what you could call a miles itself. It's the same identical guy. The Norse had them. Everybody had them. And it just, again, the possibility in a less stratified and poorer country to just provide with lots of them, and especially with the traumatically burdensome cost of providing these guys with a level of collective training, right? So to operate functionally in open field to the best of tactical effectiveness is something that requires, again, a massively structured polity, administration, and so on. And this is where gradually Europe is heading, right? And these guys are a bit like the indicator of that from a military point of view. But do not underestimate the levy, because as we've seen also in the previous videos, that they participated in pretty violent combat still next to the militaires that would dismount at a point on foot also to make the first ranks of the phalanxes, but they could beat each other pretty hardly, and the Slavic ones were pretty tough as well, even in say relative open ground. So Otto's army, again, as had been true of Henry the Fowler in 929, had received Bavarian reinforcements, this time led by Duke Henry of Bavaria, Otto's younger brother. In 954, the Margrave of the Ostmark, Garo, was dispatched with the Duke of Lorraine, Conrad the Red, who had been forgiven by Otto for his revolt of the previous year, to conquer the territory of the Uckermark, right, populated by the Ukraini. So the etymology is actually the same one of Ukraine. I mean, the idea of the frontier, right? That there is the Kraina between Austria and the Ottomans. In modern times, Ukraine takes the name from, it was actually the old Russian Palatinate, but because of the frontier, let's say, with the Eastern powers, etc. And this land is located essentially upstream the Havel River, east of the Elbe, between Saxony and the Oder. So from the other side you have across Pomerania, right? So another land, and this whole territory would be part of the North Mark later, right? So between the Mark of the Billungs in the north, on the Baltic, and the East Mark, the Ostmark, in the south. As we've seen for the summer campaign of 929, the Slavs inhabiting this area had not just been the target of the Ottonians early in the year, but different groups attacked at the same Saxony, right, and were pushed back and crushed at Lenzen, still on the right bank of the Alps on the Slavic side. Now, the interesting thing is the guys that here Otto sends, right? This is a minor theater overall, because Bohemia is the bigger chunk. These are essentially in the north still tribes that do their best to remain standing on their feet, but against a much more unitary. But they have Saxony as a neighbor, right? So at that point, that's literally the royal, eventually imperial house ruling across Central Europe and beyond. So it's not an easy life. Just saying, and this is the proof of it. However, the Marker of Garo comes from the Ostmark, so in the south. So it's a guy that knows essentially the peoples, the areas, what are the proceedings, let's say. And Conrad the Red, rebel Duke of Lorraine, is sent like a bit as a punishment, Gulag style, in the east, right, to fight against this incredibly savage frontier. And by the way, Conrad will die the year later at the Battle of Lechfeld against the Magyars. So this is like a bit of a Germanic hero's tragic fate. It proves still, however, the sort of redemption under the royal banners against such kind of national threat from Hungary. Now, Henry the Fowler, as we remember before, had been involved in these areas, and we've not seen that after 929, and specifically 4 and 5 years later, had been campaigning in the Ukrainian lands, right? Except these areas are, we will see now, they're peculiar because they're very militarized. There is not a fixed center, but many fortresses that you have to storm, and they're not even that small. And back in the day, the same Eastern Frankish king had not attained any permanent control over this province. Garo, however, attained in 954 now noteworthy success, especially bringing back immense booty. Right, Widukind in his Res Gesta says "Preda ingens." Right, so this tells you, of course, what warfare was like, but in these areas of Central Europe, still very seasonal to some degree. It's already a bit more advanced, and the Germans fundamentally plundered these areas to weaken them, to deprive them of manpower, labor force, of agricultural resources, of cattle. All the stuff you can't take away. So this means, of course, that, as we will see now, what had happened, as usual with the Slavs normally, was that they would flee in these Fluchtburgen, so very strongly defended fortifications that in the Uckermark counted as many as 17. Right, so the entire region had organized itself in the very last generations with these this massive net, right, of defensive works to exactly like in the anticipation of this German raid, so that as much as possible could be brought in time at the arrival of the invaders within these burgs, protected by the walls. And saving at least as much as possible, but the villages in the open plains, etc., would be ravaged, right? It's not, admittedly, there wasn't much there, and especially after the people had moved. I mean, that these economies were basically the survival rate. That we would be shocked by the incredible and primitive misery, but not just, among the Slavs, generally speaking, like in Central Europe during the 10th century in the first place. And so the Slavs, we've seen it from the Byzantine side, in the Pseudo-Maurice Strategicon and Leo the Wise's Tactica, were habituated to this kind of life. Their settlement was designed strategically to afford this kind of immediate evacuation. The routes, there were still, hidden paths, things that, of course, were designed specifically, like in other fringe areas. We've seen it in Celtic warfare. During this time, it would go on for a long time, right, before these lands were fully feudalized, etc. That favored the dispersion of people and goods, right, in the anticipation of the raids that would occur. So one of the Uckermark fortifications, Drense, or at Drense, because I don't think we know how it was called, right, as a fortress in the first place at the time. That is 8 kilometers east of Prenzlau and 34 west of the Oder River. So this is very somehow deep east, right, compared to the extension of the province, the width of the province, and also the distance from Saxony. I mean, not an enormous one, right? But you do not have like the Elbe Valley as a major artery that you can send the ships, etc. There is the Havel, right? But still, the land is pretty bitter, right? Other than that, so as we've seen, the previous campaigns had not been so successful in the first place, was very well archaeologically documented. So we can picture what these Fluchtburgen looked like concretely, right? These fortifications were started from the late 9th and the early 10th century, and throughout all the course of the latter, they were continually improved, showing that the German threat was increasing, right, and that surely also some local development was affording that kind of concentrated amount of resources to be invested, especially in such a necessary need like defense, which brought the walls to grow from a width of 6.4 meters to 14.2 over a period of several decades. You may say, well, it's not such a dramatic deal, but consider that was some sort of homogeneity in these structures. So it is still very costly for the population. Remember, there is very few surplus in general. So this is actually a huge increase. We're talking about earth and timber walls protected by substantial stone facings, also to avoid, fires, etc. So they're bulky ramparts that are further protected by deep ditches, right? So that the attackers that wanted to storm the walls would have had to go down 8 meters in the ditches to eventually attack the other, as we've seen, several or even tens of meters tall ramparts, right? So we're talking up to 10, 20 meters, right, to climb in some way with ladders, etc. Naturally, there were ways to fill the ditches in some way, etc. But still, if you need to bring siege machinery, etc., you need a base. It's under enemy fire, and the technology involved naturally is very primitive. There is nothing really refined, but everything works pretty damn well, right? Some of these tactics were pretty basic throughout all the late Middle Ages, but even the early modern age, right? The idea of throwing javelins or stones is something that was very useful even in time of, gunpowder technology, right? And these were, even in some of the deadliest means, employable. So that's where the milites actually must intervene, because in order to climb these walls, you need an incredible athleticism in a terribly pressured situation where you're consuming the point of these guys was maintaining cold blood, right? Every imbecile can throw himself at the enemy, hyper hyped, and of course wasting all the energy is being cut down anyway. You have to maintain steady nerves, carrying out the tactical and technical deal that this involves, functionally, collectively, directly, without hesitations, have to punch hard. And in order to do this, you must have a lifetime training, right? You cannot improvise it like one day just by chance, right? And this is the reason why basically just the militaries have this capacity. At least other troops would storm the walls as well, but just after them, and also with impressive individual capacities, but usually much less, collective training, because that's what the levies do at the end of the day. And from the other side, you still have guys with a defensive advantage that are defending fanatically and bloodthirstily their own settlements, their own women, their own children. And so the sheer level of violence here is something unspeakable, to say the least. As we've seen, the Ottonians, especially against the pagans, wouldn't have any problem in massacring, enslaving, deporting, whatever, right? It was completely normal. That's what the Slavs did themselves all the time. So there's a big market out there. We're still in the Viking era. So it's just usual business, right? It's absolutely normal to them as to anybody basically in the world at the time. Now, in the autumn of 955, so we've seen the previous year, things had just opened, say, a path like further in this northeastern theater, right? So in the autumn 955, as a sort of side dish, right? At the end of the season, Otto himself launches another major invasion of the frontier, right? This time directed against the Obodrites that are instead in the north, like across the Elbe, essentially east of Holstein, right? So the areas of Oldenburg, it would be a bit, say, up to Rügen, right? What the march of the buildings would have become, right? So the northernmost of the Western Slavs, the northwesternmost of the Western Slavs. And this people is pretty wild, by the way. These are essentially the Lübeck, for example, will be founded on a previous Slavic settlement that had gone destroyed among the quarrels between themselves. So again, usual tribal violence. Again, the Viking world is just across the sea, and the Slavs also happily participate every once in a while, or have to cope with these Norse intruders. At the same time, because they're very fragmented. Here there is not such a thing like just the Christians or the Vikings and whoever said no. They do atrocious things on one another on a regular basis, because that's literally the only thing they do with anyone. So this people is important to subjugate, exactly because of the access to further Baltic coastline, right? Possibility to frame better Denmark under the Germanic influence. The trade that is surely increasing historically in the area. In fact, will be at a point monopolized by the Germans with the Hanse. That's why I mentioned Lübeck before in the first place, aside from the anecdote here. And the reason, by the way, why this Ottonian invasion was carried out was a retaliation against a series of Obodrite attacks on German fortifications in the regions east of the Lower Elbe that was already colonized, right, just south on the Jutland, basically. This had happened exactly while Otto was scoring his great victory against the Hungars at Augsburg, the one on the Lechfeld. So you understand there was a degree of coordination surely between these eastern foes, right? And or at least they knew when, in that case, the Saxon army especially had left for these from the northern abodes, right, to go in the south of the country, and automatically you would have other peoples taking advantage of that. But say strategically it was not short-sighted. It was literally the only thing they could do, right? Because they understood they would have pretty bad things would have happened in the medium run, right? So if on the short run you could accumulate on something, even betting, it was a gamble, as always war is, right? For example, I don't know, Otto being defeated by the Magyars in the south. Well, at that point they would have profited further, etc. So things went otherwise, and this Obodrites knew, of course, that these were bad news in the first place, right? So this autumn campaign, by the way, in the north, right? This lands are just we can't say northern Europe rather than central one. In September, October, with the means of the time, with the energy, say the sources of the time, it's not just nothing, right? It was done, right? Obviously. And this were just smaller challenges, given that especially Saxony was just bordering with these territories. It would be the Nordalbinja fortresses that the Obodrites had just stormed, right? So they were the Ottonians were close to their bases. They were working in their backyard. Let's put it in this way. So in September-October 955, Otto's army marches some 240 kilometers northeast of Brandenburg, under Havel. So interestingly enough, this is an operation carried out from the south, not even from because the main bases were around those places, right? In fact, Magdeburg, Brandenburg, that was the heart. It would go down the Elbe. I inserted some map here, right? 200 kilometers, reaching a major ford at the Recknitz river. That is located essentially between Kessin, Wolgast, right? Not far from Rügen, west of Rügen. Let's put it in this way. So these are. It's interesting because there are some lakes, some swamps in between. So probably the Obodrites thought that these areas were kind of less penetrable than others. But that's where the Ottonians saw the strategic opportunity. And this fort, in fact, was used by the Obodrites to intercept the Ottonians and essentially trying to prevent their crossing. We are on October the 15th. So Otto was confronted by a major Obodrite force. The sources speak of ingens exercitus, right? So talking about the bulk of the Obodrite forces commanded by the Slavic princes Nako and Stonjev that were essentially trying to prevent the Ottonian army to cross the Recknitz river from the north and east, and so entering in some of their core lands, fundamentally. So you can imagine at this point just the harvest having been stored, news of this invasion having arrived, so also a large amount of men being free available for defense that was urgently and desperately needed in such a circumstance, right? So Otto, on that occasion, essentially keeps the enemy busy by tormenting it across the river with archers and catapults. This was meant to show that the Ottonians wanted to break through anyway. Considered that there were no bridges apparently here, so still the fording could have been possible under enemy fire, but naturally very risky as well. In the meanwhile, Otto dispatched a column of troops under the command of the Markgraf Gero, including some allied Slavic Rani, another people who may have known the place downstream better, right? So that they marched for 1 mile along the bank and built at that point 3 bridges of boats for the army to cross right out of the side of the Obodrites. This was naturally an outflanking maneuver, which we do not know, of course, from the Obodrite side whether it was, anticipated in some way. At least they figured out, right, that the Ottonians were doing so, because eventually they did send some troops. They didn't make it in time before the pincer movement of the Ottonians started, right? The boat bridge was a bit the standard in this part of Europe, where again bridges, more permanent infrastructures were really lacking generally, right? So the Carolingian military had been able to carry out to pull off some extraordinary logistical feats. The Ottonians were a bit the hares in this circumstance, of a generalized military practice, but with their power of means and also of ingenuity, like strategically in this case. So when Gero sent the word back to Otto that the bridges downstream were completed, Otto dispatched his mounted forces. See what he does. He first sent some, say, not throw away, but still not the elite, right? Because who knows, maybe the Slavs were doing something similar, right? So the crossings 1 mile downriver are secured, and therefore he sends his shock troops, right? At least some of them, largely made up of the military households of his magnates, to cross at that point the both bridges and launch, obviously, a flank attack on the Slavic right at the fording when the armies were confronting each other. So at that point, consider the Obodrites had mostly foot soldiers. We've seen this for the Western Slavs. They did have, at a point, of course, a considerable amount of cavalry available, but mostly, and especially this northernmost, had at least counted more on their infantry, right, on this also static defense of some sort based on just determination and not having more sophisticated means, like say refined tactics to carry out just stubborn fanatic resistance that was at times quite effective frontally. But at this point they found themselves outflanked, so they partially moved their infantry to check like the movement, the arrival of Otto's mounted troops from the flank. This is a common maneuver. In many circumstances, you send a detachment to try to stamp like these, this smaller, of course, enemy contingents that carry out normally this outflanking maneuvers, right? They're not the majority of the troops normally, but they're very good, right? And in any case, What matters at that point are the moral forces, the fact that while the flanking party advances, also the main Ottonian force does across the river. By the way, the latter covered by archers and engines, so something that the Slavs really had archers, engines a bit less, but say here the idea is that missile power is not enough to naturally to break the Slavic resistance frontally, but to still support the punching force of the Ottonians against the front line. And so this pincer movement is carried out successfully because the Obodorite army at that point disintegrates, right, during the attack. Right, it was just strategic by leaving the initiative to the enemy, even in such advantageous defensive position, because they couldn't really do more than that. So also the numbers likely were creating more confusion than anything, because coping with a flank attack requires a very high level, again, of collective training. These guys mostly are, have common mass to frontally stand like with what they can do better as infantry fundamentally. And the Obodorite army disintegrates in the process, right? Of course, the Ottonians pass through them, slaughtering them in large numbers, and the Obodorite Prince Stoinev is killed during the retreat, apparently by a German soldier named Alsed, who was awarded 20 mansi, so this standard unit of land plot value, by Otto I for the actual accomplishment. Right, we do not know how it occurred, but let's say aside from the violence of it, like you can imagine, like either a chase or let's say a cornering or some sort of lust stand as well, because this is also what happens normally in any say defeat that leaves one unit, well, the rest flees, fights to the last, a bit because of glory. Like these leaders, of course, were a bit the ones whose entire political career was invested in the success of such military enterprises, and to allow the others to flee or more easily, right? So this was a bloody page of history, after which Otto began a sustained program, in fact, of conquest across the Middle Elbe into the lower and upper Lausitz, right? So they went a bit back and forth, right? First into this to this north on the Recknitz River, then further south on the East Mark. So it was always hammering a bit here, a bit there, so that everything would be kept in check, right? Giving the time to accomplish this further consolidation, just showing morally that there wasn't much of a move against the empire that would go unpunished, which was the most important thing, even just for the internal order in Germany. The various noblemen that had conferred power to the Ottonians was, of course, still trying to escape the centralizing policy of the realm. So these military achievements were a bit the measure also of the capacity that the Ottonians had to intervene within the same Germany. It was a bit different inside, and so, as you know, the elective profile of the monarchy would be maintained. Would be great difficulties, but this was essentially destined to become the Imperial dynasty, and they worked relentlessly to form a more concentrated power also in Germany, right? There are other campaigns carried out by Otto, either personally or by sending someone else on this eastern frontier. Between 955 and 960, the monarch led personally armies in the east on at least 4 occasions, right? So almost every year, 956, 57, 59, and 60. During Otto's extended absence in Italy from 961 to 963, where surely lots of things had to be handled directly because of the novelty, the imperial crowning, the relation with the Italic kingdom. I made a video about, by the way, Otto I and Otto II's Italic reigns, so that gives you an idea of how they operated very differently from Central Europe, telling you the truth. Markgraf Gero, in the meanwhile, launched several additional campaigns on the eastern frontier, finally capturing all of the main Slavic fortresses in Lusatia by 963. So we're in the north of Bohemia. We will make a video about it at some point as a historical region. Well, these campaigns were directed principally towards the capture of the Slavic fortifications, either by manning them with Eastern Frankish garrisons or replacing these structures or razing them to the ground with new ones built somewhere else. We've seen it in the other video, like in 929, the main center of the Dalaminsians, Jana, was essentially abandoned as main center of what would become the Mark of Thuringia, and Meissen, that would be in fact the historical center of the province, was founded specifically on the Elbe. So there were naturally strategic considerations dictating this, because of course these same fortresses that were used to defend the country were not necessarily always useful from one side, were useful to defend it, to guard it from the other, right? So you needed to build at least others at some point, and especially taking control of them in the first place, as we've seen with these military operations, where a big deal of a fort was carried out properly by the militants to storm the enemy fortifications. Some of them, of course, would simply give up, but mostly when they were to be conquered for good, they also knew whomever was there that likely they would have ended up massacred or in slavery. So this was truer also for the smaller places, meaning, as we've seen with Bohemia, there was no greater purpose of destabilizing a central power that could be easily co-opted within the imperial hierarchy. On the contrary, you could even get an ally in that at times, but these smaller centers were really not important for anyone except those who lived there, right? Because north of Bohemia, there wasn't really like a major conglomeration, right? You could say, well, we can't work on them. These places had to be conquered and fundamentally, let's say, restructured. Let's put it in this way, like the entire regions for a successful colonization, right? So, as brutal as it sounds, they weren't needed, nor the people who inhabited there, if not as slaves, etc. It would be a work of German colonization to some degree, albeit it would take really centuries, right? We've seen it in the video, especially about the Margraviate of Brandenburg, that is born exactly from this area and this operations that, was like in some areas, like the Slavo-Germanic identity was basically obvious, because many Slavic leaders were now becoming German vassals of some kind, right? There were marriages also to one another's line and so on. So this, especially in these least stratified places where you had to go literally, in fact, castle by castle, so lordship after lordship to take over. You would be more brutal at a point, but also more rewarding towards others that would cooperate, right? So the thing had alternate tones, let's put it this way. So we will keep seeing this frontier at some point, also in previous times, because we missed a bit the Carolingian background, which is also fascinating. But it's mostly about how they organized these expeditions. The Elbe helped, of course, a lot to consolidate a power also on the right bank. And some of these bases would remain stably within the Eastern Frankish Kingdom later on. So on the longer run, they were a success. At the beginning, it seems as if they were a bit places of scarce value to invest in, but really the disturbance that these peoples caused in general, and the possibility that they would fall also under the rule of some other power, right? As we've seen, the Magyars mobilizing some of the Slavs against Germany, but also the formation of Bohemia, of Poland, with the Piasts, etc., was a complex issue that at some point the Ottonians thought of invading, and they did invade Poland at some point, but Bohemia was within the Holy Roman Empire and Poland wouldn't be. All right, so all things that really happened step by step, gradually, and that you have to get a bit into the political intricacies of to understand also from a strategic point of view, because as always, war is just the continuation of politics with other means. So for today, I stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.